Welcome to Book Club. I'm really into fun facts. Julie has an endless array of pop culture knowledge. Overall, I would say I liked it.
Something about the way she writes is like really concrete and immediate. Who is this man? Why is he in this costume? Like, why did he drop a squid? Like, you teased some juicy deets about the creation of this book.
This is, again, what Victoria finds interesting, not what is actually most important about these people.
What stories are we going to tell ourselves about this year?
Welcome to the party.
Welcome, guys.
Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria.
We are two roommates and friends since high school who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as a tool for personal and community growth.
This week, we are reading Red at the Bone by Jaqueline Woodson, and we will be talking about the entire book. So, if you're a person who cares about spoilers, this is your official warning.
Yeah, and if you've already read the book or you don't care about spoilers, you're totally welcome here if you don't care about spoilers. Welcome to the party.
Welcome!
I was on a call with a friend this week, and she was just catching up on things, and I mentioned our exciting new membership program with the podcast, and she was like, oh, I know you guys always say to read the books, but I don't, and sometimes I just listen anyways, and she's like, she felt so bad, and I was like, oh man, we gotta reframe how we say that at the beginning, maybe.
Yeah.
But it was interesting and I shared with her that a third of our listeners who responded to our survey
don't read the books.
No, a third said they do read the book every time.
Okay.
2/3 say that they listen even if they haven't read the book.
Yeah.
So if you haven't read at the Bone, you're in good company.
Yeah.
I mean, just kidding. Julie and I have read the book.
Yeah.
But many listeners out there may not have, and we hope that this is a good entry point and that you might be inspired to pick it up next time you see it as an option.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely that way. I listen to podcasts about movies that I will probably never watch, and, books I may never read, and, it's just, you're just here for the vibes, man.
Here for the vibes and the conversation.
Yeah.
I used to, anytime in a podcast, they're like, oh, I'm going to spoil it. Skip ahead 20 seconds if you don't want to hear it. I'd skip ahead, and especially when it comes to TV shows and movies, I'm like, who am I kidding? I'm very likely not going to see this. Yeah. And even if I do, I'll likely forget.
Yeah.
I heard so many Game of Thrones spoilers, but because I hadn't watched the show for the first 6 seasons, I was like, I don't know. I don't care. Yeah. What is that name? There are so many names.
Yeah.
And then I watched the show and I absolutely loved it. And there was nothing that I was like, oh, so-and-so 3 years ago dropped that thing about so-and-so, and now here we are.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. You are, the ideal audience, though. I think every TV writer wants you as their audience because you never see anything coming, and you forget... And you don't ever remember if someone spoiled something for you, and so you're just always even if you've seen it before, you're still surprised.
It's always fresh. It's always new.
So all that to say, everyone is welcome. We just wanted to give a spoiler warning at the top.
If you care about those things.
Yeah.
So Red at the Bone.
Yeah.
Is a book that was recommended to me from a friend of mine in my, I used to call it my real book club, and Julia would get offended. It was my formerly in person, now virtual on Zoom book club. That is not this podcast. Anyways, we were sharing book recommendations at one point, and I just wrote them all down. And then at Christmas time, when a family member was asking what I wanted, I just sent them my book list. And so it was wonderful. I got, books I wanted, but it was still a little happy surprise because I didn't know which ones they were getting me. And Red at the Bone was one. I didn't really have much preconceived notions about it going in.
Yeah.
Other than, oh, I've heard of this. I've heard people say good things about it. I've seen it on Instagram. It's got a very beautiful color blocked cover with, the title nice and big, Jaqueline Woodson. And I loved it. I read it quickly. It felt like a really different pace than what we've read recently.
Yeah.
And that we've been preparing. We've got some bigger challenge books, you might call it,
Yeah.
set up for later in the season that we've been chipping away at. And so this was like, I read it in maybe 2 or 3 days and like a few short sittings. The character growth and analysis, or just like exploration of these characters, I found really fascinating, and overall enjoyed it.
Yeah, I read this in like 2 hours. It's it was a delight. I sat on our little love seat we have next to the window, and the sun was shining directly onto my head. I felt like a cat, sort of curled up in the sunshine, reading my book with my, my music in, and I read about half of it in an hour, took a little lunch break, read the other half. It was a lovely afternoon. This style of writing is just like so much my jam. It's like it's like one of my favorite kind of books to read, where it's just like not about anything exactly. It's just like people in these small moments of their lives and being reflective, and these like time jumps forward and backward, and kind of, it just gives me this certain like swirly feeling. I don't know how else to describe it, but I really love this style of writing, and she's an incredible writer, and I had a blast. So yeah.
Sometimes I appreciate book recommendations for very specific moods, and I would say if you are looking for something to read but feel intimidated by everything because it's just been a hard week or a hard year and finishing a book seems kind of impossible, I think this one, you mentioned earlier, like if the formatting was slightly different, could be considered a novella.
Oh, easily.
And not only is it length, because there are some short page number books that are short that are still really dense. And this book, like you said, that swirly feeling, I just feel like it just pulls you into the world so quickly, and then you just want to stay in it. So then you do continue reading at like a pretty fast pace. Yeah. But
it's got huge margins and like very spaced out. Like there's not a lot per page either, so it doesn't look intimidating when you open the book. You're like, oh, yeah. I can read this.
Yeah. And at the same time, like, sometimes you want a book that maybe feels, like, more escapist or more lighthearted. And while there are hopeful moments in this book, I wouldn't necessarily classify it as lighthearted.
No.
And deals with some, like, real tough issues and situations in life, specifically from the Black experience growing up in America. And so I feel like, if you're looking for a book that is intellectually potentially challenging for you, if you don't identify with the Black experience, and that's something that's a little bit more removed from your own, it might be challenging in that way or eye-opening, but at the same time it's very like engaging, because it's a swirly read. I just love that now.
Swirly.
It's a swirly read. It just like sucks you into the world, and you're like just immersed.
And it's a family story, it feels sort of close and intimate, and all those things that you can't say to the people that you're closest to kind of story.
Yeah.
So as we were prepping for this episode, I learned a lot of things from Victoria about Jaqueline Woodson, so I'm very excited for you all to hear what her research has uncovered.
Okay, so I will say up front, there's probably a lot of listeners out there that are like, yes, Jaqueline Woodson, I'm familiar with this prolific children's literature young adult writer. And I, to you, say, that's amazing. I'm so sorry that I didn't have this knowledge sooner.
Yeah.
I was blown away, like, reading about Jaqueline Woodson, that not only has she published, like, a book a year since 1990, pretty much, she's incredible. Really been a force in children's literature to increase the representation of children of color, specifically Black children, in the stories that children are reading, and to diversify the books available to students, so that she uses the analogy from Ridian Sims Bishop that books should act as both mirrors and windows. So providing a mirror for children of color who don't see themselves in literature that's out there, and then providing that window for people who don't have that same experience to, you know, broaden their understanding of the world around them. Jaqueline Woodson is an American writer, and she moved from South Carolina at the age of 7 to Brooklyn, where this book, Red at the Bone, takes place. So she's lived in Brooklyn most of her life, and she graduated from Adelphi University, and initially after college she had a couple different jobs, but one was writing short stories for standardized reading comprehension tests.
Interesting.
So if you grew up in like California, Texas, it was like one other state, your standardized reading test might have been written by Jaqueline Woodson.
Wow.
At age 27, she published her first book, and since then has just been writing all the time. She's received nearly every prize under the sun. The Coretta Scott King Award multiple times, the National Book Award, the Newbery, the Caldecott. She won the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, which I was not familiar with before then, but before this. It's a $500,000 award, and with that, she set up Baldwin for the Arts, which is a fellowship for emerging artists of color. And then recently she's won the MacArthur Grant, otherwise known as the Genius Grant. That funds she's using to continue her work with Baldwin for the Arts, and the Hans Christian Andersen Award, which is the highest international award for children's literature. So all that being said, awards and stuff are cool, but as a human being, as a person sharing stories, I found Jaqueline Woodson, not only is her writing really engaging, but she's got a great interview she did with the New York Times columnist Kat Chow, where she talks more specifically about her life in Brooklyn and seeing how the neighborhood has changed over the years, and specifically as it ties to Red at the Bone, the house that her mother had bought in Brooklyn when her mother passed away was kind of going through the experience of, do we sell the house? They decided to keep it and renovate it and turn it into rental property, but there's baggage with that. Her mom bought it for $30,000 originally, but because of predatory loans, which is a practice that affects many Black homeowners, she was $300,000 in debt when she passed away. And so that personal story of what does it mean to have a home, and what does wealth look like, and how is the laws and practices in American culture hindered Black people from obtaining and maintaining and growing their own wealth generation to generation, which is a huge theme we see in this book.
Absolutely. Yeah. When Victoria sat me down and was like, she has won every single award, she's written a book a year since before we were born, like, this woman is an incredibly successful and influential and prolific writer, and neither of us have ever heard of her before we read this book. It was just like such a, I don't know, one of those moments where you're like, wow, I have been living in a little white bubble. Like, all of the school libraries that I went to, and like, I never saw a single one of her children's books anywhere that I can think of. Never had any recommended to me, and I know a lot of, like, all my friends at that age were readers, and it just made me a little angry at kind of the institutions that I grew up with, and so I'm like, I could have been reading this woman's writing so much sooner. But then also kind of just highlighted a lot of the problems to me in the, like, book industry as a whole, of how much farther we have to go in terms of getting diverse stories into the hands of all children. So, yeah, that was a big, like, whoa, I had no idea.
I felt similarly of, one, a bit of embarrassment that I've always been like, oh, I'm attuned to the children's literature world, like, I don't read stuff on it all the time, but that's my jam, that's the stuff I enjoy. I'm familiar with the names of of who's out there and who's writing things, specifically who was writing things in the 90s and 2000s when I was a reader, a child reader.
Yeah.
And then also kind of the continued frustration with my education and upbringing, that there wasn't a focus on introducing myself and my peers to a diversity of authors and experiences of other kids and young adults who might be different than me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say maybe these books were carried at my library and I just didn't notice them. Woodson's children's literature, I mean, this one came out in 2019 when I had been at the library when I was a small child.
Yeah.
So it makes me like reaffirmed, like this is why we do this for ourselves and hopefully for our listeners who haven't heard of Jaqueline Woodson before. If you are a teacher and, you know, want to expand the books on your shelves, if you have kids, or if you're a huge Jaqueline Woodson fan, please tell us what your favorite ones are.
Yes, please.
And we look forward to reading more of her work. I mean, her memoir is specifically about living in Brooklyn. It's near, I would say near the top of my to-read list, but it's so long just for the podcast.
Yeah.
So it's in the top 50, I should say.
Oh my gosh.
It'll happen in the next year.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because we always love good, like, children's or young adult literature recommendations. And I feel like we just got handed a treasure trove of, like, potential books that we could read that aren't just the same 3 authors over and over again. So, yeah, maybe you'll see another one of her books in the future. So this book, though.
This one, Red at the Bone.
Red at the Bone is sort of an intergenerational, like, family narrative. So you get, each chapter is from a different person's perspective within this one sort of family unit. There's, the story is centered on this moment of the granddaughter in the family, Melody. It's sort of her coming of age ceremony. She's 16 and they're having a big party, and so all the family's there and friends and everything. That sort of sets up like who these people are. So there's Melody, and then her parents are Iris and Aubrey. Iris, well, the two of them, they got pregnant when they were 15. Mm-hmm. Very, very young. And Iris was at a Catholic school, and so it sort of disrupted their whole lives. And Iris's parents are Sabi and Po Boy, and they are relatively wealthy, whereas Aubrey, Melody's father, you also see his mother's perspective. Her name's Kathy Marie, and they are significantly less so. It moves back and forward in time, and it's kind of all about trauma and wealth and love, and she accomplishes all of this in so few pages. It's like, it's incredible. But yeah, it's one of those stories where you just like fall in love with all the characters and their complicated relationships and histories with each other. And yeah.
When we were sitting down to plan this episode, Julie and I were both like, okay, what's this book about? This book is about nothing and absolutely everything. The family narrative aspect of it feels so true to like a family experience where you do everything with your family and there's nothing specific, you know, that has to be said. I mentioned that Jaqueline Woodson started the idea from this book after some personal experiences renovating her mother's house after her mother passed away. And she writes, actually, you pointed out, Julia, at the end, there's kind of like an interview with the author, and she said she set out to write a book about generational wealth, or she was thinking about that. She does so in a way that, like, you totally get that that's what she's talking about, but there's not like a conversation where a character explains to you anything.
Yeah.
It's just there.
I even wrote in my notes, like, it's interesting that her original question was about intergenerational Black wealth specifically, and this question of, like, where did it go or what happens to it? When the story becomes so much more, and it feels like a really difficult story to pin down because it's I mean, like we already said, like, it's about everything. It's about, like, every aspect of human life and the way that everything affects everything else. So, like, yeah, she started with a question about wealth and trauma and, like, the sort of the uphill battle that Black people in America have had to fight constantly to maintain their hold on their own selves and their own stuff. But that seeps into your friendships and the, like, ordinary conversations you have with your neighbors and what you study in college and, like, what you think about love and relationships. And there's all these little moments. Like, it feels so close and intimate, this story. You don't get Po' Boy's perspective very much. Maybe even only once. But I remember it vividly because it's him reflecting on his life with his granddaughter on his lap when she's, like, 4 years old. And he's just sort of, he travels to all these memories, and then he keeps coming back to the feeling of having her on his lap and she's asleep. And he's looking at her hair, and he's looking at her cheekbones, and they look like her grandmother, and, like, something that small and close and personal. It's very hard to pin down, like, this is exactly what the author was trying to say, right? Because every time you pull one thread, 12 million more follow, you know? They're, like, which is a sign of a great writing, right? Because it's sort of agendaless, right? It's like, I'm going to just show you the hearts of these people that I have fallen in love with, and you can take from it what you want. Very open-handed storytelling. So yeah, it makes it very compelling, but very difficult for us to talk about, because we're like, wait, if we talk about this, then we have to talk about that. And if we talk about that, then we have to talk about this. And where do we even start? I don't know.
Yeah. And sometimes when we talk about fiction, Julie and I will kind of highlight a couple characters as kind of entry points to specific topics or themes we want to talk about. But we kind of discuss that none of these characters can even stand on their own. Like, to talk about Iris is to talk about Aubrey and Melody and Sadie, and to talk about Po' Boy, you talk about Sadie as well. And like, there's no one just standing on their own, because their lives are so interconnected, as lives are.
Right, exactly.
This podcast is made possible by our fantastic book club members. You can support the show by becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. Starting at $3 per month, book club members can connect with fellow listeners, help us select books for future episodes, unlock exclusive posts and messages, get early and discounted access to future events, and more. And if you want to take your support to the next level, you can join the TISM tier, which starts at $5 per month. The TISM tier is all about autism. Are you an autistic person looking for community? A possible neurodiverse person looking for resources? Or an ally hoping to learn more from an actually autistic person? Members of this tier get free access to Julia's autism-related articles on Medium. The best part of any book club, besides the books, is the community. So join us in our growing community of book nerds by becoming a member of the book club today. Follow the link in our show notes, or go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv to join the party. That's buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. We'll see you there.
So Iris and Aubrey.
Iris is kind of like the center of the story.
Yeah.
But again, you can't really talk about her without, getting into the people that are connected to her in life. I went back and forth liking Iris and not liking Iris. Like, I was always rooting for her.
Yeah.
But I was kind of frustrated with her at the beginning, when you can see in the very first scene that Melody doesn't have, like, that much of a relationship with her. Or it's not very close.
She calls her by her first name.
Yeah, Melody always has referred to her as Iris ever since she was, like, a little girl. But then at the same time, I have sympathy, because Iris was 15.
Yeah.
She was so young.
Yeah. And you really want her to finish high school, and you really want her to go to college, and you really want her relationship with Jam. What's Jam's full name?
I don't know.
Oh, it's Jameson, like the whiskey.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. You really want that relationship to work out. Like, you want her to have everything, but you also want her to be there for her daughter. And she can't really do both.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it really heartbreaking. I was like, I really, really empathized with her. I was like, honestly, I think if I were in her position, I feel like there's a solid chance I would have done exactly the same thing she did. Like, but she's very closed off. Even the way, that she is with Aubrey, like, he is very open about how much he loves her. He's very open with his love in general. Like, his mother is, like, his whole world, and then he meets Iris, and suddenly now he sort of describes it as, like, it's sort of broadened, and now his whole world is now 2 people, and then Melody's born, and now it's 3 people, and it, like, he's very content, too, to, like, have family, and to, like, go into work every day in, like, a mail room, and just, because Iris says, like, oh, he's really smart, like, he could have done very well, but once he finished high school, he was like, yeah, I'm good, I don't need anything else, I'm good. Whereas Iris, he can see in her how distant she is from him. Almost from the very beginning. Not quite from the very beginning, but pretty close. Mm-hmm. And his view of her is constantly realizing, oh, I'm losing her. Oh, I already lost her a long time ago. Because she was never really open in herself and, like, fully present. And it's not until a girl in college breaks Iris's heart that she sort of fully realizes how closed off she's been to people for so long and how much she was protecting herself. And she's like, oh, this is what real heartbreak feels like. Yeah. And that's where the title of the book comes from, Red at the Bone, is from that breakup. The core of the book in some ways feels like this sort of Iris trying to maintain herself and her own sense of self, her own being as a separate entity from the rest of her family so that she can succeed in some way and not get absorbed back into them and, like, cease to exist. And Aubrey just kind of holding it down.
After Melody is born, or when Iris is pregnant with Melody, she basically gets kicked out of school because she's at a Catholic school. They didn't really want her there. And so she's kind of homeschooling herself and kind of falling by the wayside with that. And Aubrey's mom actually is the one that kind of steps in and supports her. And this is her, like, kind of preparing to leave. Had it not been for Kathleen Marie, she would have ended up in summer school. Fuck Our Lady of St. Martin. Fuck summer school. Her brain was on fire, hungry as hell. The public high school was only 2 blocks away. She'd go there. She'd blow it out of the water. She'd leave here. She was already mostly gone. At this point, she's still only in, like, the 10th grade, and she's just already, like, on her way out. And the more we talk, the more I'm reminded of my sympathy for Iris. Like, I think of, like, who I was at 15.
15!
And I was the same. I mean, I wasn't pregnant, but I was definitely like, I'm ready to leave town. Yeah. Like, I'm ready to go. Like, the whole, like, my brain was on fire. Like, I was just ready to dive into college and have that academic experience and continue, like, my education. And then later on, when Melody is a bit older, you kind of find out that Iris has been living outside the family home. She's got her own apartment. And Melody goes there, like, some weekends. And part of me is like, oh, like, Iris, be more part of your family, like, be there for your daughter. But also I'm like, that's who I was at, 20-something. Like, I wanted my own place. I wanted my own life. I wanted to, like, be in the city. And I think this book doesn't come out and say anything like, this is what teen pregnancy should be or shouldn't be, or this is how we should think of the people who are involved in a teen pregnancy, the mother and the father, and, like, it's not prescriptive in any way, but it just makes you sit and think, like, why shouldn't she have all the same opportunities even though she is a young mother. But then you also see Aubrey, and I think that's maybe one reason why I get frustrated with Iris is because Aubrey is like, he's there. Like, he's ready to be, like, I mean, he was 15. Was he ready to be a father? Probably not.
No.
But he, like, steps up.
Yeah.
And he says, like, this is my family. I'm going to be here for Melody.
Oh, it's so complicated because in a certain way, having Melody is actually an instigator for Aubrey's upward class mobility, because he loses his mother, and because he's so active in Melody's life and willing to raise her so that Iris can go to college. Like, Iris's parents, like, he moves in with them. And they own property, and he's able to live with them and, like, make connections and get a job, and he has, like, a pretty, like, I don't know, average middle-class family life in the end. Whereas you see this moment for him when he first finds out that Iris is pregnant, and the options available to him in his immediate community, in his neighborhood. The richest person in his neighborhood is, what's his name? Sliprock, who is a drug dealer, but he has the outward signs of stability. He has a solid car, and he's got, you know, an apartment, and he's got, you know, he seems good. And he seems like he can provide that kind of immediate economic stability for Aubrey, and he's very tempted by it. Because he's like, I have a family to raise. This is what is in my immediate vicinity. And he sort of wrestles with it for a minute. He's like, I know it would be really easy. But because he has a place with Iris's family, he has options. And so he's like, oh, I don't have to do this. It's tempting, but I don't have to. And I think I don't want to, and I want to do this thing instead. And options, a lot of times, is like one of the biggest signs of economic growth or stability. You know what I mean? Is like to have a choice. Whereas for Iris, having a baby really holds her back. As is the case for, you know, a lot of women. Like, not having complete control over their own reproductive rights and health can really, like, keep women trapped and prevent them from having options and growing their career and all this kind of stuff, which you see with Aubrey's mom. Aubrey's mom, Kathy Marie, where, like, she was getting her master's degree when she got pregnant, but she didn't have anything to fall back on because she was sort of raised in foster care, and so then she ends up in poverty to raise her son. And so, like, in order for Iris to continue her sort of upward mobility, she really needs to leave the baby behind in order to be able to go to college and make connections and get her own apartment and all this kind of stuff. Their relationship sort of revolves around Melody, and it's very interesting how the situation impacts them so differently, I think.
Yeah. That's a good point. Like, there's the different expectations from different classes. Like, to reiterate what you just said, but, like, Aubrey has an opportunity almost to, like, step up.
Yeah.
But then there's also the gender narratives going on with that, whereas Aubrey choosing to stay and, like, I'll get the job and I'm content here, we're like, oh, look at this man really stepping up, where it's like, that's just baseline expectations for a woman.
Right.
And for Iris to kind of push back and, like, I'm going to continue on my own path.
Yeah.
Like, if a man had done that, would my instinct have been like, oh, really? Like, yeah, you should be with your daughter. So now I'm like, oh, I need to reassess my own bias.
Yeah.
But when it comes to having a child, there are those different pressures put on in different times. And continuing with your education is not impossible with children, but makes it so much harder. I think particularly with our, like, education landscape, there's more options now for, like, part-time and non-traditional students. But generally it's like, up and move your life.
Yeah.
And like full time do this one thing, and
with no like childcare.
Yeah, childcare not provided. It's very expensive.
Yeah.
You may not be able to work.
Yeah. And if
Yeah.
you do like a grad program, like you get paid in like toilet paper and a prayer. Like just, you know, like it's not enough to raise a family on. Or,
Yeah.
Yeah. You had talked about how they don't see each other's wealth or lack of it until they meet and go to each other's homes. Like Aubrey doesn't see his own poverty until Iris is in his house, and suddenly he sees it all differently. And he's like, oh, I never noticed that before.
Yeah.
And vice versa. Like she doesn't think anything of it.
That feels like such a shared experience that I feel like so many people have that moment when they're like, oh, I didn't realize I was rich. Or, oh, I didn't realize we weren't rich.
Yeah.
When you have that comparison moment. And I think it's so well done in the book too, because to talk about wealth, you have to talk in comparisons. And we get that moment for both of them. Do you have a moment when you realized, oh, my family is wealthy, not wealthy in comparison, or shifted your mindset of what you thought of your friends?
I feel like it changes with every single person that I meet. Because I feel like my family is very decidedly middle. We are very, very much right in the middle. And so, you know, depends on who you are. You know, we also went to a private school, but my dad taught there and your mom worked there. And so we had a significant discount. Whereas, you know, a lot of the people we went to school with had like, oh, I remember there was this one kid who used his dad's private jet to take his, we were like doing a group project for philosophy class, and we had to go to a university and like interview people about their worldviews, and used a private jet to take his group to like some school. I don't even remember where it was. It was like Fresno State or something. And I was like, hang on. A, you own a private jet. B, you can just use it for school? I was like, so, yeah, that was a pretty crazy moment. That's a really extreme example. But I didn't realize the degree to which people that I saw every day were wealthy. Until I was like, wait, that's a real thing? Like, that's not just like a supervillain thing? Like, real people have private jets that they use for their children? Yeah, that was pretty crazy. But then also, like, I feel like, yeah, I think I felt more poor as an adult when, like, I see, since graduating college, like, how much debt people have and whether people were taught about investing and, like, how much disposable income they have, and then, like, the connections to get started in a cushy job versus, like, not so cushy job, and, like, that whole sort of comparison wheel, I tend to feel very poor. So I'm like, my parents gave me debt. I don't know. How about you?
I think the experience going to a private high school definitely made me feel like, I mean, we're fine. Like, we can, with, you know, financial aid, I'm able to go to the school. So, like, things are working out. And then I would, like, go to a friend's house and it's just massive.
Yeah.
With, like, lots of land and, like, they have their own bathroom on their bedroom.
Oh,
like, they don't have to share any spaces. And, like, it's just, I'm like, oh, that's the kind, like, oh, you're not on financial aid.
No.
That kind of moment. But then there was also, like, I think as a high schooler, I was probably more conscious of it. And, like, I'm so sorry, Mom. I, like, complain about, like, not having the newest clothes or being able to go to, like, film camp over the summer or something like that. And then, yeah, just gaining perspective and realizing, like, oh, how much I do have. And I had a friend who didn't go to that school visit my house once and was like, oh my gosh, your house is huge. And it's all, again, like, it's a comparison game. And I mean, this is now, like, a different conversation, but I've been doing a lot of reflecting on, like, what it means to manage money and how we think about money and what we own and ourselves.
Yeah.
And the damage we can do by constantly comparing and by assuming we need the next big thing. You know, the next apartment has to be bigger than the current apartment or something like that.
This book also was it was an interesting moment of, like, realizing, oh, neither side of my family has money, but both sides of my family have other types of wealth. This kind of cultural capital of being artists and writers and teachers and, like, being very college educated, extremely educated on both sides of my family. We just didn't go into lucrative careers, but I'm the third generation of women on both sides of my family to go to college, which is incredibly rare, like, just in the world. So, like, both my grandmothers and then mothers and aunts, like, all went to college. So, yeah, we're, like, an exceptionally educated family. And so, in that aspect, this book really made me think about the extent to which that provides a great deal of wealth, even if it's not cash, you know?
Yeah.
It's a different kind of capital, but it still has afforded me a lot of opportunities.
Like those connections and the understanding of, like, these are the steps you need to do. Like, these are the rules out there that people may not tell you.
Yes.
Or you really should be thinking about this when you're a junior and you're like, why? I'm not going to college for another year. And it's like, oh no, but this is the timeline. And you're like, okay.
Yeah.
And you just do it. And when you don't have that, you know, if you're a first generation college student, you don't have that model to look up to, it can be really difficult. And I think also the expectation, like, if you grew up with the expectation, like, I am going to college, that's some level of financial stability, family support structure. Like, if you never had to question the idea that you were going to go to college, like, that's a huge privilege.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we see that with Iris, who's like, it was expected. Like, that's just what you do. And, you know, her mother, I think she's saying it to Melody?
Yeah.
But you can assume she said the same thing to Iris of, like, oh, like, you can join Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, like, because you're a legacy, because that's where I went, and, like, or that was, you know, my sorority, and, like, that, like, constant pressure, but also constant encouragement that, like, you can do it, and it will be a thing you do. Where with Aubrey, even though his mother was educated, they were just, like, in such a hard situation because she didn't have that support system when Aubrey was young and throughout his upbringing, that we don't get a full picture of it, but it doesn't sound like he had the expectation that, like, college is a thing I will do. That is a thing I have to do.
There was a very brief mention of, in a list of things that he's giving up, one of them was college ball. So, I'm not sure what type of ball. Basketball, football, soccer ball, I don't know. Baseball. I don't know what sport he plays. But there was some inkling of an idea for him that he could do that could be a way for him to go to college. But he didn't seem that attached to it. He gave it up pretty happily. Iris, when she's working with Kathy Marie, and it sort of lights that fire under her ass, part of it is because she never questioned that she would get into college. So she never really had that, like, drive that she needed to, like, make it happen. And hearing about the power and importance of education from Kathy Marie, who's like, this is your way out. Don't do the same thing I did. Really is what makes her realize, like, oh, this is a big deal. And I need to make sure I do this for myself. And that's kind of a big sort of watershed moment for her. So speaking of Kathy Marie.
Yeah.
Like you said, there's not a lot. She hides a lot. There's a lot she doesn't say. She only tells Aubrey about his father once.
And Kathy Marie, as a character, I feel, yet again, is most understood through her relationship or contrast with others. So we see Sabi, Iris's mother, who literally has been able to accumulate wealth to a point that from her family passed down that she keeps, like, gold bars in the house because, like, I don't trust the world and we will be secure. Like, we
Yeah.
will be able to take care of ourselves.
Mhm.
Is able, because she had the connection and the support through her young adult life and getting married, and she was able to have that support, where we see Kathleen Marie, who Aubrey's father was not really in the picture, and he wasn't a good support. She didn't have, you know, a full support system around her, and so she wasn't able to necessarily save up that wealth, nor was it passed down to her. And we see that very explicitly in the fact that she comes from like a foster care system. It's not just like mom and dad couldn't support me, it's like they weren't even there.
Yeah.
And she's coming from that almost like rock bottom nothing. But at the same time is still like a very loving mother, and Aubrey absolutely adores her, and she does, you know, what she can to provide for him.
Yeah, she it's interesting seeing her through Aubrey's eyes, because he keeps trying to wrestle with like his understanding of what Kathy Marie just calls the system. He's like, what is that? He can't quite figure out what it is. And for a lot of people, it's what they call the foster care system, but you get a sense that it's not just that. It's like the whole thing of it, you know, the whole, how all of American society is sort of set up to prevent Black people from getting out and succeeding, in this sense of like, there's always some form, there's always some loophole, there's always something that sort of keeps you down, and he can never quite get a handle on it when, like, and he never really asks her, like, what do you mean when you say that? But he sees the toll that it takes on her, and she ends up dying of cancer.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Whereas Sadie, she was literally raised, she had like 5 parents or something, because
yeah, she's like the only child, and it was like an aunt and uncle or
who couldn't have kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they all lived together,
and she also grew up, she's sort of the line of, or the legacy of like Black wealth. Because I thought it was interesting, she her mother was a little girl in Tulsa when the massacre, what was it, 1921?
I think so.
Occurred, in where the neighborhood, sort of colloquially known as like Black Wall Street, was just like destroyed and burned to the ground by white people. But her mother was able to escape. She was like a little girl, and then was moved to the south side of Chicago, which was another area of Black wealth. So then her aunt and uncle were like a doctor and a nurse, and like couldn't have kids, and so she had like this sort of, all these adults who like had, you know, successful careers pouring all this into her. She sort of is the one sort of carrying that legacy of wealth throughout the story, and puts it into gold bars so that she can pass it on to her kids, because she's so terrified something like Tulsa is going to happen again. And she doesn't trust banks, which, I mean, we really shouldn't. We should, but we shouldn't. I don't know.
Understandable why she doesn't.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Sadie is one of the characters that has just kind of rolled around in my head for a while. We get this really traumatic, loud scene when Sadie like loses it when she finds out that Iris is pregnant.
Yeah.
It reminded me of the Poet X. The scene between mother and daughter. That one was not about pregnancy, but it was still about, you know, being with a boy. So from the get-go, I'm like, I don't really like Sadie. Like, I'm sure that's a super difficult thing to hear, that your 15-year-old daughter is pregnant. But I was like angry at her for a while. But then we also get more and more of Sadie's character. Like, they lost their first child, and like how devastating that was. And while Sadie had a really great support system, she was the only child. And after her and Po Boy's son passes away, they kind of don't have anyone left. And so they kind of pack up and restart. They kind of need a fresh restart in New York. New York City. So yeah, again, there's just so many layers to these characters, and it's hard to just pull out one thread and say like, she's concerned about wealth, and like that's one character trait of her. When you start pulling that thread, you find so much depth to her, and then the amount of like love that she pours into her family, and I love her relationship with Po Boy. Very very sweet.
And you see things that Iris didn't necessarily see, because Iris just felt the brutality and the shame that Sadie was sort of taking out on her. But Sadie also like calls out her priest and the leaders of Iris's school. Like, she sticks up for her child and like gives up a lot in order to protect her. Whereas it's interesting, even if you compare the two reactions between Kathy Marie and Sadie to the knowledge that they're pregnant. Like, it's almost like Kathy Marie takes one look at when she first meets Iris, and she's kind of like, oh, I already know.
Yeah.
She doesn't have much of a reaction to it. When Iris calls, she's like, oh, okay. This is what's gonna happen, isn't it? Whereas Sadie is like distraught and so upset and scandalized, and she can't get out of bed, and I don't know how to read into that, but it's really interesting.
Yeah. Like,
is there a kind of class expectation when it comes to teen pregnancy as well? I don't know. So what did we learn?
This book was really interesting to reflect on what does it mean to talk about generational wealth. Often we think of what is, your inheritance. Like, are you going to get a stack of gold, from your mother when she passes, but also the inheritance of education, the inheritance of family support, the inheritance of community support. Property's huge, and there's so many elements to it. But we see in American history so many times that Black people have been denied the ability to grow their wealth, to even have wealth. We're going to talk about it in a future episode, but Ta-Nehisi Coates has a great article, A Case for Reparations, that was originally printed in The Atlantic. And reading that, it's a long read, but it's super detailed and was really eye-opening to me. I was, aware of racial injustice, but not in the specifics of like, you can't buy a home here. We're going to give you only this kind of loan, which is predatory and is basically impossible to ever pay off. And all this terrible oppression, time and time again, that the Black community has not been able to necessarily, in a lot of families, build up the wealth that their equivalents have in other in white communities.
Yeah. It definitely made me think about the wealth that I have that is not money, and sort of to think about in the broader sense, which is really just talking about privilege, right? Yeah. But realizing, like what things were assumed when I was growing up that are not always assumed for everyone, because it's hard to dig those up because they're assumed, right? Yeah. Because you don't talk about them, they're just there. So I feel like I'm always uncovering new ones.
Yeah.
And this book definitely did that for me. And also it leaves you, the way the book leaves you is like everyone dies. It's just Iris and Melody left. All the other characters die. And like there's this sense of like, oh, they kind of have to cling to each other because they're the only ones left, even though they can't really, their relationship is really strained for a lot of reasons. Yes, the book ends with them digging up the gold bars in the stairs. There's this, like, they're gonna be okay. You have that kind of feeling. But there's also, like, they have lost and suffered so much. And they're, luckier. In a sense. So I really liked the bit in the back of the book. It was really helpful for me in terms of guiding my reading of, like, when Woodson says, like, I wanted to emphasize how Black people survive in the US and what it takes. And that really, like, I didn't realize how attached I was to the book, and then I almost started crying in the last chapter, because I was like, this is so... It just, you don't know what the feeling is, but it just leaves you with a feeling, and you're just like, woof.
Shoutouts and shutdowns.
Yes.
So
our new segment.
Our new segment for the little bits that we want to highlight or criticize that we didn't have a chance to. I don't really have any shutdowns at all this time. No critiques, really.
Yeah, me neither.
My shoutouts, there's a beautiful beach scene before Kathy Marie passes away where they all go to the beach together with Melody as like a small child, and that's beautiful. And another part that we didn't even touch on is the way that Jaqueline Woodson uses 9/11 as kind of a counterpoint to talk about Tulsa. And those are like the two traumas, like national traumas that specifically affect this family, because Aubrey was in the World Trade Center on 9/11, and Sadie's grandmother her family was devastated by the Tulsa massacre. And if you aren't familiar with the Tulsa massacre when you're reading this book, I think it does a good job being like, you know how scared you felt?
Yeah.
Do you know how much that tore apart and traumatized the city of New York and that community and the survivors? If you aren't aware what Tulsa did, that's how Tulsa felt. And then it also specifically ties in on the story of Black wealth. Yeah.
I had a very much like frustrated with the system moment when I realized, like when she referenced Tulsa, and I realized the only reason I knew what she was talking about was because we had watched Watchmen.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is so messed up that I had to rely on, I mean, an incredible television show. It's great. I'm so glad it exists. But also, it shouldn't have to do all the work. It's fictional! It's an alternate reality. It shouldn't have to do all the heavy lifting of educating about, like, a very significant event in American history. Anyway, yeah, I was annoyed by that. And, okay, a shout out that I have, the relationship between Melody and Malcolm, I thought was very sweet, and I wanted more of it, and I wanted to understand it better.
I wanted Malcolm's point of view.
Yeah. Because they're technically dating, but, like, they both know he's gay, and he talks about it very openly with her, and they're more like best friends. And so when it's just the two of them alone, they're very sweet with each other, and trust each other a lot, and talk about, like, their hopes and dreams for the future, and how they want to fall in love, and you're like, oh my god, they're so cute. But yeah, I really wanted... to me, that was the most interesting part about Melody. And I wanted more of that.
So for people who enjoyed reading Red at the Bone, what would you recommend they check out next?
Yeah, in terms of a very short and intimate and kind of sad, but feel-good family story book, Talking to Ourselves by Andres, I think it's pronounced Neumann. Could be wrong though. It's spelled Neuman. And then we've recommended this book a bazillion times, but Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I bring this one up specifically because of the discussion that book has about property ownership and the generational wealth effect that has on Black women specifically in the UK. And that was a really interesting part of that book that I found, and so that connection was interesting to me.
I mentioned this book already, but The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo is the story of a Afro-Dominican woman growing up in New York City as well. And that one's written in verse, which I really enjoyed that. And one of my notes, too, is that I feel like Red at the Bone has a very poetic feel in many ways. Yeah. So I think The Poet X would be a good companion read. Yeah. So, the last segment, I was almost going to say the best segment. I would say the whole episode is probably pretty good, but this is our fun segment.
This is where we kick back and have a blast.
Things that are bringing us joy, things we're currently obsessed with.
Okay, currently obsessed. This is technically currently obsessed from about a month ago, but I'm trying to release my currently obsessed slowly over time instead of all 9 at once. So Run River North has their new album Monsters in Your Head came out like a month ago, and it is very good. And I discovered a new podcast that, again, is old. It ended in like the last 6 months, but it's over. But it's called the Tableau Podcast. There's a Canadian rapper, songwriter, poet his stage name is Tableau. He does this podcast. It was supposed to be him talking about music, but he just talks about the most random things with his producer, Diane, and sometimes his manager, Eddie, is there, and it is the funniest. It's one of the most funny, like, free-flowing, free-form podcasts I've ever listened to. Like, it's about nothing, and it's so funny. So yeah, if you just feel like hanging out with some people, if you're feeling lonely, that's a great one. And then also, I just watched all of this in one night, but I think I brought this up before. Staged, there's a second season of it. So Staged is a quarantine TV show made in the UK, starring David Tennant and Michael Sheen, who were the 2 leads in Good Omens. And it's like them being on Zoom in their homes trying to rehearse for a play. And it's so funny. And they just released a season 2. And it's somehow better. I was dying laughing. I watched the whole thing in one sitting. It was so funny. Just the 2 of them together are comedy gold. It's exceptionally British, though. Someone described it as like the 2 angry Celtic dads that we all need. Because one's Welsh and one's Scottish. But yeah, that's a great time. It's on Hulu in the States.
Nice.
Yeah.
I don't remember if I recommended this on the podcast before, but Dirty Rotten Church Kids is a podcast. I think I've mentioned their Instagram account before, but I've been digging their podcast. They have exceptionally long episodes.
Oh, no.
So just break it up in chunks. You can do it. Or put it on when you're doing a long trip. But they recently did an episode with Grace Baldridge, who stage name is Semler, and she put out an EP called Preacher's Kid. The episode's fantastic. The album's great. It made me cry. In a good way. Like good tears.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely recommend, especially if you grew up in the church.
Well, we made it.
We
weren't sure what we were going to talk about. But
we talked about things for a while.
We talked about things for an hour. So look at us go. That's a podcast. What do? We talk about things for an hour. That's our job. All right. And this is where the outro would go.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Book Club with Julia and Victoria. Chime in with your own thoughts and recommendations on Instagram @bookclubwithjb or through the contact form on our website, www.bookclubwithjb.com. Our website is also where you can find show notes for this episode, which include links to any of the recommendations we gave or other tidbits we mentioned. Make sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're currently listening, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple while you're there. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Febland, and Rebecca Gesney is our project manager. We'll catch you all on our next episode. Happy reading!